Hello, everyone. My name is Jim Seberg, and I'm the Assistant Director for the Medical Cannabis Research Center at Drexel University. Today, we are happy to be joined by Dr. Ben Cocchiaro, Dr. Emily Ansel, and Tom Fontana. I'm going to be talking about tolerance breaks today, the existing research that's out there, existing interventions that are out there, and future directions of research in this area. So I'll pass it over here. I'm going to start the presentation in 1 second. I'll pass it over to Dr. Cocchiaro to lead us off.
All right. Hi there. I'm Dr. Ben Cocchiaro. I'm a co-investigator with the Medical Cannabis Research Center. I also work doing addiction medicine at Prevention Point Philadelphia and bread and butter family practice at the GPHA Southeast Health Center at 8th and Washington here in South Philly. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about tolerance breaks. We're going to talk about the physiology behind them. We can go to the next slide. We'll talk about the physiology behind them. We'll talk about the more behavioral or psychodynamic modes of undertaking one. And we'll talk about some recent research that's been done looking at and taking more critical eye towards tolerance breaks and their effects. So we can go to the next slide now. So there's over 712,000 patients and 37,000 caregivers registered in the Pennsylvania Medical Cannabis Program as of May of 2022. It's probably even larger now. Medical cannabis is largely considered safe, but regular use can lead to tolerance and increased dosing needs, which present a higher cost burden for users and possibly an increased incidence of adverse events. Although habituation is generally an issue with chronic users, it begins to occur even within a week of initiation of use. So there's popular interest in short-term cessation or tolerance breaks or T breaks involving voluntary reduction or cessation of cannabis use with the aim of resetting this tolerance process to the therapeutic effects of cannabis. Among non-medical daily cannabis users, this habituation was demonstrated to be reversible with the implementation of tolerance breaks. That said, there's scant literature on the subject of tolerance breaks. I'm lucky enough to be speaking on a panel here with the only 2 authors in PubMed on T breaks. But many of the folks who are trying to take tolerance breaks haven't read through PubMed. They're relying on unvetted information from internet message boards, and there's little agreement on the recommended duration of these breaks or the extent of their risks and benefits. So I'm going to walk you through some of the basic science of cannabis tolerance and explain how we know what we know. We can move to the next slide. So the acute effects of cannabis fall across 3 major domains. There's the psychomotor, where we find dose-dependent reductions in memory, decision-making, attention, impulse control, and motor function with people who are naive to cannabis or infrequent users. We have physiologic symptoms, where infrequent users may experience tachycardia or fast heart rate or hypotension or low blood pressure. And psychotomimetic symptoms such as dissociation, confusion, anxiety, and paranoia. Among people who use cannabis regularly, tolerance is observed most consistently in cognitive and psychomotor domains, with increasing frequency of use associated with decreasing severity of these adverse effects. This is true to a lesser extent with the physiologic and psychotomimetic symptoms that may persist despite a person using for frequent or protracted periods of time. There was a 2019 study by Mason and colleagues out of the Netherlands that administered roughly 20 milligrams of THC to a dozen occasional and a dozen regular users and measured their test performance on and fMRI scans. Among occasional users, they noted that impaired cognitive performance, increased levels of subjective high, as well as striatal glutamate concentrations, and decreased functional connectivity of the mesolimbic circuit with the nucleus accumbens. So what does that all mean? Striatal glutamate concentrations and the mesolimbic circuit have to do with the brain's reward pathways. And these are pathways that are engaged whenever we engage in anything pleasure-seeking. Food, drugs, runner's highs, things like that. They all integrate with that nucleus accumbens and striatal circuit. So in occasional users, you see impairment in these centers, whereas cognitive performance, functional connectivity of the mesolimbic circuit and striatal glutamate concentrations, they're virtually unaffected in a group of chronic cannabis users that were exposed to the same dose of cannabis, indicating the development of some form of tolerance. We can move to the next slide. So tolerance can be thought of as neurobiological or behavioral. These things are deeply linked to one another, and we'll go into that. But from the neurobiological perspective, millions of years of evolution have outfitted our bodies with a number of negative feedback loops designed to help us adapt to changes in our environments. If you have a neuron that's triggered by the binding of a substance to a certain receptor, here in this diagram you see a CB1 receptor, over time, that neuron can adapt to higher concentrations of any kind of ligand or thing that triggers it. You see these yellow and orange dots. That's what they're meant to symbolize. So the neuron adapts by decreasing the number of receptors and thereby reducing its sensitivity to being triggered. With regard to cannabis, the CB1 receptors in our brains can be triggered by endogenous substances like anandamide or 2-AG, which are made by our brains, or exogenous substances such as THC. Suppression of excitation or inhibition by any of these triggering substances, which we call ligands, occurs in the mesolimbic fronto-subcortical circuit that contributes to cognition, reward, and emotion. So this happens rapidly over the course of days in chronic daily use, but doesn't seem to establish itself in occasional or even frequent near daily use, indicating that tolerance via this mechanism of CB1 receptor downregulation may require constant levels of THC present in the brain. And this is where we jump into a little bit of conjecture. We know that THC binds to fat cells, so it's possible that people who are using frequently have a large storage compartment of THC that exists in their bodies, and even after they stop using cannabis, may have to evaporate slowly up off of those fat cells, kind of like gasoline off a wet rag. But beyond this somewhat oversimplified mechanism or mechanistic understanding of tolerance lies a broader behavioral conception involving complex behavior, such as learning, and implicates the volitional control over the effect of cannabis that's possible. It seems that this volitional control, so sort of willing yourself to negate some of the adverse effects of cannabis, might be confined to a small range of performance parameters and is generally absent across a wider range of impairment indicators. They've done a lot of driving studies, for instance, that call this into question. So behavioral tolerance was suggested by these early rat studies, but the driving safety studies suggest that the effects are muted. However, there was an interesting placebo-controlled expectancy study published by Gunn and colleagues in 2017 and found that the expectancy of having smoked cannabis, so a person's expectations of what the effect is going to be, regardless of whether or not that participant received placebo or active THC, decreased their impulsive decision-making. So there is some volitional control there. If a person thinks that they used cannabis, they may be able to compensate for that on some level. But let's take a step back and look at this over the bird's eye view. We know that cannabis tolerance exists, and we can even loosely describe the mechanisms by which it operates. But does it ever go away? We can move to the next slide here. So we do have two different ways of knowing that this tolerance process can be reset. We have neuroimaging and neuropathology studies. There was a mouse study done that looked at CB1 receptor density after up to daily injections of, I think, 160 milligrams per kilogram of THC, so a large amount of THC. They found that prolonged abstinence resulted in the normalization of both the number and function of CB1 receptors in animals in just a few weeks, occurring more quickly in reward pathways than in memory pathways. So this is, going on the 7 to 14 day range in in reward pathways and in the 14 to 21 day range in memory pathways. When it comes to humans, D'Souza and colleagues in 2016 used a CT scanning methodology and found a global decrease of 15% in CB1 receptor density in a sample of cannabis-dependent users compared to controls who were not using cannabis. However, after a period of abstinence, these group differences in CB1 receptor availability were no longer evident after 2 days and 21 days of monitored abstinence. So these CT studies seem to suggest that your CB1 receptors will recover relatively quickly. However, we have behavioral studies that indicate that longer periods of abstinence may be required. So in 3 studies conducted between 2001 and 2005, residual cannabis effects were found to be no longer apparent at 3 months after cessation of regular use, even among former heavily using young adults. A 1999 study found that tolerance to the cognitive effects of THC was still evident after 4 days of abstinence. And a 1977 study found that they were able to note only partial recovery after 1 week of abstinence. So if we take this all together, even though the CB1 receptors recover at, maybe 2 days, maybe a couple of weeks, there are still some effects that can be noted at 4 days and 1 week, and it may take up to 3 months going by these behavioral studies. So just as we can consider tolerance from the perspective of one single feedback loop, that CB1 receptor, or through a more holistic lens that accounts for the multiple overlapping feedback loops within the brain and the brain's connection to a wider social milieu, we might also consider the breaking of tolerance in the same light. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Tom Fontana, who's going to describe a tolerance break guide that he developed while counseling students at the University of Vermont.
Yeah, thank you so much, y'all. Tom Fontana, he, him pronouns. It's a real pleasure to be here and on this panel. Thank you for the opportunity. I work at the University of Vermont and coming up on 10 years, and I talk to students, a few hundred students a year one-on-one, often through the conduct process, though students self-refer and our psychiatrists send people over, and then proactively with groups and teams. And a lot of what comes up at the University of Vermont and in any school, UVM would want me to qualify, is a conversation around cannabis. We talk a lot about weed and how's that going for people and their experience and relationships. And somewhere around 8 years ago, 7 years, I was talking to students a lot, and tea breaks were coming up, and I'd ask them, hey, how's it going taking a break? Or have you taken a break? Asking regular users. Certainly not everyone uses cannabis. And the regular users of cannabis or weed were like, yeah, I should have been taking a break. Or they're like, I did take a break, but I went to do a week, but then I only lasted 3 or 4 days. And I kept hearing a theme of people struggling with taking a break or trying to take a break, or starting it in the 3rd or 4th day being really difficult. And so I had the opportunity to listen to some students who had made it through and what worked for them, and the students who struggled. And then from that, put together a guide, which I'll get into in just a little bit. And that guide was starting to get adopted. It's now being used by over 100 colleges, either reference or directly used, which is amazing. But we're like, hey, if this is out there, we should be studying this. And so the state of Vermont gave me some money, and we ran a pilot study, which I'll then tell you about. But before that, let me just look at a little definition, a little history. A lot of people are out there. This is a Reddit. There's Reddit. There's a million things on Reddit if you're out there. The Reddit r/trees. That's how Reddit works, right? The R are their communities. The r/trees is the large weed community. There's many others, but and then there's r/leaves, which is people who are in cannabis recovery from cannabis. And there's r/petioles, which I've come to learn means small trees. I didn't know that, which is all about tea breaks. So there's about 140,000 people online who are part of this group, and yet there really is no set definition. But there is a lot of wisdom in this community. A definition I simply use is it's the voluntary break, really regardless of motive. Dr. Ansel will talk in a little bit, and I was the first to explore motives, which seemed to be really important. And so for reasons, she categorized tea breaks for that reason. But in my experience, just talking with students broadly, a tea break is just what they say anytime they're taking a break. And then you might say, oh, how come you're doing that? And then they might say, oh, because I want to lower my tolerance, or because I have a P test coming up for a job, or because flying somewhere. They might name internal or external motivations, but as they just call it all a break. And the history, which I've been fascinated by, there's so many subculture things in cannabis that I've really been on the lookout for and trying to figure out the roots of that. Kind of 420, right, with the time and the date, the association with weed smoking is fairly well established. The history of that coming up in the 70s and friends out in California. But the word tea break, I really had no insight on until recently. Someone did give me at least a little context. He's in his 50s and his parents still alive in their 80s. He grew up on a clandestine weed farm in upstate New York. And so they would grow and watch out for the helicopters coming overhead. And he was saying, for all through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and even much of 2000, weed, cannabis, was a plant grown in the ground outside, right? And because of that, it had natural cycles. Just like your grocer might not have tomatoes in February back before we figured out that supply chain, your weed dealer didn't have weed in February because there's ebbs and flows, or it was dry as hell with seeds and stems in it. You're like, no, thank you. And so he was explaining there was just natural ups and down times just because of the growth. And it's really been in the last few decades with indoor grow operations, both illegal and legal kind of ways that it's distributed, that the potency is way up and the availability is way up, which has led the community itself to come up with the idea of tolerance breaks, which is what's really important. They've been talking about the need for this, and we're kind of catching up. And so, but that increase of availability leads to what we're looking at here in the next slide. I just call this idea of the problem potency or the trouble with tolerance. It's, if I have a student in front of me who says that they like cannabis, I'm not going to tell them they don't like it, right? We're using a motivational interviewing approach. It's not how anyone I think on this call would handle it. And if they're telling me it helps them medically, my science brain would wonder, okay, is it placebo? We've seen some articles that have questions about that, but mostly it's like, if something's helping you, that's great. My question is, how do we keep it helping you? Because what we know with the increased potency of this product is that you're going to develop tolerance quicker, and then you'll either need more or you'll just get diminished effects. And that really creates the need, the rational kind of desire for people to seek out tea breaks. We put together this guide, and you'll see the layout here on the slide. This is kind of just a few things together. It's a physical booklet. It's available online with the little Go link under there you could try. But students actually like, hey, thanks, Jim. Jim's got a copy, and I should have one sitting here. My daughter took it to give to a friend. She just took the copy. She's like, Dad, but she just texted me. I grabbed it off the desk. I'm sitting in my son's room, so I'm just using my whole kid's operation here. But we put together this guide, and the students like the physical copy for various reasons, but there is an online one, and it's a booklet, and it lays out over 3 weeks. We looked at a 21-day break. There is no a 28-day break, I would say, is even better. It's probably the gold standard. 21 days seemed a little more approachable for people. So that's where we set this. Each day has a quote and then anticipates some of the struggles somebody might be having at that moment and gives some thoughts about that or some strategies. And so that's kind of the general layout of it. It compares with like the DSM. It was not, we didn't base it on the medical definition of this, but if we look at withdrawal as defined by the DSM, and it's 3 or more of the following things: irritability, anxiety or nervousness, difficulty sleeping, decreased appetite, restlessness, depressed mood, and kind of one of the following: abdominal pains, the night sweats people talk about, chills or fevers. So 3 of the 7 of those. We'll see that it really links together with, those are represented in the week 1 and 2 in particular. Week 1 of the guide looks at the physical experience you're going to have when you first have tolerance break, which is really withdrawal. And that's where most people were getting jammed up. They wanted to stop. Their sleep was thrown off. They were not eating well, perhaps if they used it to eat regularly, so their appetite was thrown off. A lot of things were going on. It was like, okay, if we can address these things right on, let them know these are regular and they will pass. We wanted to put the physical stuff right up front. And then week 2 focuses on this emotional journey. Okay, maybe the night sweats are a little diminished, maybe a little bit, some of the sleep stuff is going back, but now you're feeling some withdrawal, irritability, anxiety, boredom, loneliness, different things. As a general colloquial rule, I would say withdrawal is the opposite of the effects, right? An opiate, well, it has many effects, but it's one thing it does physically, right? It slows down digestion. So withdrawal from opiates might involve pooping a lot, right? So both physically and mentally, the effects you're going to get through withdrawal are the opposite. And since weed has a broad category of how it impacts people, I invite people to think about what is the type of high you get. If you smoke weed and feel more connected to friends, well, you're going to feel more isolated during a tea break. If you feel more intellectual, that your mind's running and you're more creative, you're going to feel more bored during your break, right? If you're somebody who feels that it helps calm anxiety, well, you're going to feel anxiety raised during a break. So we try to hit these different things. But the DSM didn't really capture, I think, all of the experience. And to get that, I think we have to turn to our friends in Marijuana Anonymous, MA. Really a great, I think our friends in recovery can offer the best spectrum of a view on a substance, right? People who don't know it can certainly learn a lot about it. People who are in the use can tell you some things, but the people who knew the hell out of it and loved it and then decided I might have loved it too much or it might not have been good for me can really give us an amazing perspective. And I think they give us a rich definition that helps invite people to know if they're maybe have a challenged relationship with cannabis or marijuana in their 12 questions, right? There's the 12 traditions and the 12 steps. They have the 12 questions. And this is really one of the most informed nuance looked at, I think, what cannabis use can look at. And these questions, right? Do you get high alone? Does weed let you, look at number 7, does marijuana let you live in a privately defined world? That's a great weed question. You could ask it about other drugs, but it's not quite the same, but that's some insight right there. And so these questions are really reflected, again, not so much consciously. I look back after defining these based on students, but some arrows on the next slide will show that these are really reflected in what we're doing in week 3. We're inviting people to look at that spiritual, that's a strong word for some, just existential, like internal connection, external connection, and what's going on. And initially people would tell us, in the research we'll look at in 1 second, that they grab the guide for help with week 1 and 2 for the physical stuff, but afterwards it was week 3 that really got them thinking about things. And so we have a guide, and I was grateful for Bridget Karski, who was a student who helped really, then became a research assistant, and Dr. Andrea Valenti, who was at UVM and then moved to Rutgers for her mentorship and study design. The method was that we ended up looking at 125 students. We looked at 18 to 29. We had other people outside of that age range, but for the study purposes or for the data purposes, we narrowed it. And just to say, it was really quick. We got approval by the IRB. I think it was 420 or 421. And I was like, thanks. Like, we now have like 2 more weeks left of school. And we put up our table, and we needed to close down the study because we didn't just want UVM students. We ended up getting students from over 12 different universities. But there was so much interest in this. And so that was just really interesting to see, and I was not expecting. We got 125 current cannabis users who were willing to take a break, and we offered them the guide. They were not obligated to use it. So it was not a randomized study. It's actually something we're now proposing. But the measures were, we were looking at, did they end up completing a 21-day break? What happened after they stopped? We were only able to investigate at 30 days. We didn't have funding to look beyond that. What was their confidence in taking a future break? Did they change their definition of balance? And what happened to other drugs during a break, right? Where do you just replace it with something else? And so we sorted it by this idea of people who use the guide, none, some, or a lot. And just to show you the results as the final slide, when we looked at, it turns out trying to take a break seemed like a good thing for most people. But the people who used the guide a lot were way more likely than the people who used it not at all to complete their break, kind of 84% versus 54%, to be planning a future break already at that point by about triple, 30 to 10. Report that their definition of balance changed. Report that they didn't actually see themselves using cannabis in 3 years from now at a much higher ratio. They said taking a break was worth it. It felt like to the people, to most of them, but to the people who used the guide. And interestingly, drinking less alcohol or stopping during a break. It seemed like the people who were willing to use the guide were seeing this as an overall health break. They're like, well, if I'm doing this, maybe I'll stop drinking as well. So that gives us a little insight as to when or how people use it. And they were using less drugs or certainly not more. So it was encouraging results, and we're able to publish a paper on that, and then looking to do a little more stuff, which passes nicely to Dr. Ansel, who's done wonderful work looking at motivations for taking breaks.
Thanks, Tom. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the research that exists on tea breaks. So if you can click ahead for me, this is a sample of some of the clips that we would see on the internet. If you went to Google and you Googled tea breaks, you'll see that there's over 2.5 billion responses or pages that talk about tea breaks online. And a lot of these are commonly used websites by many people. There's things like Leafly, which is used by many cannabis users, but there's also things like WebMD, Healthline, and all of these are giving information on how to make it through a tea break. You know, how do you do it? What do you do? How to avoid it in the first place? How to reset it? So there's a lot of information out there for consumers that are looking to do this. And as you'll see you see on Google, the first thing that comes up is actually Tom's study, which is a great thing. But if we go to PubMed, which is the main resource for where we find scientific literature, you can see that there are a total of 2 studies that have been done on tolerance breaks. And those 2 studies are the study you just heard about from Tom, and then the other one is the study that I'm about to tell you about. So that is the extent of our known empirically based research on tolerance breaks. And so clearly the underlying message that I'm going to say today is we need more research. So looking at the methodology of my study, this was actually done with my graduate student, Maggie Badillion, and a crew of undergrads that were really terrific. We used 170 participants that completed a baseline and 6-month follow-up assessment. These were all young adults, 18 to 30 years old, so similar age range to Tom's study, who used recreational cannabis. This took place in a state where recreational cannabis use was considered illicit at the time of the study, and no participants met criteria for severe substance use disorders, including cannabis use disorder at baseline, past or current, because the main purpose of the grant was to look at transitions and trajectories of risky cannabis use over time. And so we didn't want to pull in people that already had certain types of patterns. So the predictors in this particular paper that was published last year are whether or not the individual had a tea break in the last 6 months. And so we define that as any abstinence from cannabis use in the last 6 months with the expressed purpose to alter or decrease their tolerance. So much like Tom was kind of inspired to go in this direction to look at tea breaks by talking to college students, so was I. And as well as the participants in our study, is that we started to hear about tea breaks. My undergrads in my lab knew about tea breaks. They were asking me questions about it. There was absolutely no literature by which I could answer any of the questions that any of them had. And so we went about trying to create a measure that we thought would capture important and relevant information, taking in information from the students, from the participants, and from other stakeholders that we asked about what might be the reasons. We also did a lot of Google searches on things like Reddit and Weedly to get ideas of what was being said out there. So that was one predictor. Another predictor, so if we defined tolerance breaks or tea breaks simply as being for the express purpose to reduce your tolerance. And we recognize that there are other breaks that people take for other reasons. And so we wanted to include those in our analysis as well. And so we call those the other use breaks. And those could be for a variety of non-tolerance reasons: work, relationships, financial reasons, legal reasons. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the results. And then the third group was the group that took no breaks over the past 6 months of the study. So next slide, please. So for outcomes, we looked at 4 primarily. The hazardous cannabis use, which was measured by the CUDIT, and higher scores are indicative of hazardous use. Cannabis use disorder severity, which is measured through a clinical DSM-5 SCID interview to assess their cannabis use disorder the criteria. And then we took the sum of the criteria that were met for a total score. And higher scores obviously indicate greater severity. We also looked at cannabis use frequency using a measure that we had developed in my lab, the HiQ, in order to assess the number of cannabis use occasions per week. Now, I want to acknowledge with that does not capture all the meaningful data about cannabis use. You can have 7 occasions per week and not consume as much as one person might in one occasion. But this is the outcome we wanted to look at. And then we also looked at the length of the use break, particularly as Tom was talking about. There's a variety of reports and recommendations on how long a use break should be, a tea break should be. And so we wanted to see what people reported as their the length of the time that they actually took. Next slide. So for our results, looking at the sample of 170 young adults, we found that 58% of them took a tea break, or sorry, any type of break in the last 6 months. So that's the majority of the participants took a break from cannabis in that time, which we thought was really interesting. Now, 17% reported taking a tea break, as in a break for tolerance reasons. And then if we look at the breakdown of the 58% overall, you can see that the majority were motivated to take a break based on work circumstances. That could be them starting a new job. It could be them changing duties. They think that might be affected by cannabis. The next 2 were having no access to cannabis and being motivated for financial reasons in order to save money that they would otherwise spend on cannabis because they needed more, because or maybe they had decided that their budget was getting tight and they didn't want to have that cost incurred. As you can see, there are other reasons that were identified: personal reasons, which was individuals saying that they said that just for themselves, they wanted to be able to do this for themselves, and that's why they took a use break. School and academics was another reason. Relationships, significant others, and family were an additional reason, and for mental and physical health, and then legal issues. We included sport in there because we'd had reports that individuals who were athletes or involved in sports would stop for the extent of their sports season. But interestingly, in the study, we did not have anyone endorse that. So in terms of the overall breakdown, you could have a tolerance break and you could have an other use break and be in both groups. So I wanted to say that. But overall, there were 71 individuals that took no break, 29 took a tolerance break, and 88 took an other use break. There were no differences in the distribution of males and females, but some interesting things to note are that those that took a tolerance break were slightly younger than those that took an other use break or took no break. And then there was those that took a tolerance break had a higher CUDIT score at baseline, so higher hazardous cannabis use score at baseline compared to no break. And so did the other use break. So both break groups had higher hazardous cannabis use scores at baseline. And one more click. And we also looked at the length of cannabis use breaks. So here you can see on the left is the length of time in weeks that tolerance breaks lasted. And then on the right is the length of time in weeks that other use breaks lasted. You can see there's a big difference there. The tea break individuals were taking 2.5 weeks for that. And that's pretty consistent. If we look back to those Google sites, the recommendations were like 48 hours to 21 days. And so we're in that time range for what's being recommended online. And this fits with the idea that they're probably getting a lot of their information from online sources. People that took it for other use reasons were reporting up to, on average, 2 months that they took the break. So there's a big difference there. Next page. Thank you. So in looking at predictors of outcomes, we were interested in hazardous cannabis use, which is in the first column, the cannabis use disorder severity in the second column, and then the use frequency in the third column. Now, all of these controlled for their baseline scores. So we were looking at outcomes at 6 months, controlling for that, which means that we are measuring an increase in those over time. So even though there were baseline differences, we've controlled for it. It reflects just an increase from those differences. And here you can say below the black line, you can see that tea breaks were significantly associated with an increase in hazardous cannabis use over 6 months and with an increase in cannabis use disorder severity over 6 months. And other use breaks were not associated with either of those. But there was no association with a change in use frequency for either of the types of breaks. And looking at, so given that, we thought that there's differences in duration between the tolerance use breaks and the other use breaks. So is this actually important in understanding our findings? So we put into a model the length of the tolerance use break and the length of the other use break, predicting the same outcomes. And down here, you can see that length of other types of breaks, so not tea breaks, was associated with decreasing hazardous cannabis use at 6 months, decreasing cannabis use disorder severity at 6 months, and decreasing use frequency at 6 months. So in other words, the longer the use break, the lower the hazardous use clinical severity and use frequency. But interesting, the length of tolerance breaks was not associated with any change. But that's important to note that that was a pretty limited range in terms of only being 2 weeks. So in terms of conclusions, tea breaks are associated with worsening cannabis use outcomes in this study. But interpreting this, it doesn't necessarily mean that tea breaks are a bad thing. We think instead that this might reflect a risk factor. If an individual can identify in themselves, hey, my level of dependence and tolerance is getting higher, this might suggest that they're on a certain trajectory for worsening cannabis use. Maybe the tea break that they took was not sufficient or not supported sufficiently to deter them from that trajectory that they were on. And this would suggest then that we do need to create, test, and offer more resources to support tea breaks to make them more effective. So the other thing that many people have asked me is, does this mean that tea breaks are bad for you? And it's really unclear because it could also be the length of time that was taken that's driving the findings. As I said, the websites are suggesting 48 hours to 21 days, but maybe we need to look longer to see real benefits. So obviously, we need more research in order to answer these questions more conclusively because one study does not tell us. Next slide, please. And then also, the other question I get asked a lot is, does this mean that other types of cannabis use breaks are good for you? And I really want to clarify that because I feel like that's jumping to conclusions. It's not necessarily so. The top 3 reasons that people reported for other use breaks are work, cannabis unavailability, and financial reasons. This doesn't mean that they necessarily want to stop their use. It just is circumstances are saying that they need to at that time. Alcohol and tobacco are readily available, and when this study was done, they were legal to use and available in those states. So it's possible that substitution was happening. People stopped using as much cannabis because of situational circumstances, and they upped their other use. So to look at this, we actually looked at additional findings to see if there were changes in consequences for alcohol use or consequences for cannabis use at 6 months. And we found that other use breaks were actually associated with increasing alcohol use consequences and increasing cannabis use consequences at 6 months. So this suggests that other breaks are not necessarily a good thing either. This is a study that we're working on getting published now. The other thing that I've heard even from some of my colleagues here is, but the measures you're using, they focus on hazardous cannabis use and they're kind of confounded by the frequency items, and that might be problematic. People have different frequencies, and it doesn't necessarily mean that that's driving hazardous use. So when we rerun the analyses that I just showed you, removing the frequency items from the CUDIT, we find that the tea break findings, the association between tolerance breaks and increasingly bad outcomes, disappear. So it is something about the use frequency that is increasing in tolerance breaks individuals who'd have tolerance breaks. And this might be suggested that, again, they are on a certain trajectory and the tea break is not deterring that trajectory. Their use is increasing over time, and that's contributing to their increasingly hazardous use. What was also interesting, though, is that when we did this, the other use breaks were also associated with increasingly hazardous use patterns when we removed all use frequency. So it's a finding that we didn't have before. And this suggests that other use breaks might be associated with the truly hazardous outcomes or issues associated with cannabis use. And this kind of makes sense to me because if we think back to what the motivations were for those reasons, they were things like relationships, work, financial. These are situational issues that might contribute to more hazardous use if you're not able to reduce your use. But overall, I would say that much more research is needed. We can't base anything on one study. And I'm excited to hear that there's a lot of other studies that will be happening soon, hopefully, to look more closely at this. And I just want to mention that this research was supported by the National Institute on Drug Abuse. That's all.
Thanks so much, Ben, Tom, and Emily. That was a great presentation of the overview of the research and neurobiology as well. And love the intervention, Tom, as well. Certainly a new way of thinking about things for me as well, being a medical cannabis patient, taking tolerance breaks in the past. So I wanted to kick off the Q&A by asking a question in the conversation that we had in one of the pre-meetings leading up to this. Is there any link between tolerance and an increase in anxiety-induced experiences of high-potency cannabis users?
I can go ahead and try to speak on that. In terms of high-potency tolerance use, I'm not familiar with specific findings on anxiety, but I do know that we are seeing more of the problematic outcomes associated with high-potency use. And so that might make sense. We might be seeing that's indicative of some of those anxiety problems.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we know about the treatment of anxiety disorders with medical cannabis is that lower doses work better than higher doses, and that higher doses may actually cause anxiety. So, I think a lot about the differences between, the strains that are hitting the dispensaries these days versus the strains that were, popular among cannabis consumers in the 1970s, 80s, early 90s. And, the old strains were considerably less potent THC-wise, but had more by proportion of the different cannabinoids and terpenes, your CBN, your CBG, your THCV, your limonene, things like that new research is starting to show have ameliorative effects on the negative adverse effects of THC. So, bring this all together, if you look at how a person might have experienced cannabis 20 years ago, they might have gotten less THC, more terpenes and cannabinoids that might have sort of softened the experience of it. And today they're getting more THC and fewer of the cannabinoids and terpenes that might have softened that experience.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation there, Ben and Emily. Now for the whole panel, are there any recommendations for self-identifying or when a tolerance break may be needed? I know, Tom, it kind of seems like there are some kind of key good points in the tea break guide, but kind of any tips for kind of self-identifying when that's needed?
I do love that 12 questions from Marijuana Anonymous. And I think there's a practical piece, right? However you buy it, you might buy in bulk because it's like going to Costco. You get it for cheaper when you buy a lot. It's why I have 10,000 rolls of toilet paper downstairs, not because I'm hoarding for the next one, y'all. I'm just because it was cheaper. But so you go out and you buy an ounce, right? And you're like, I got an ounce of weed. This is going to last me a month. And 2 weeks later, you're like, where'd all my weed go? I think that's a good moment to reflect on, oh, I'm burning through this quicker than I thought. So I think there's practical ways of simply like, are you using it more than you thought? But I also like to think about and this is less for medical folks because it's often for a different reason, but for the recreational user, weed use at first was always like, oh, a special occasion, like it was really something. Then it became more regular and enjoyable. And then maybe it's become more routine. But at some point, routine becomes a little bit like maintenance. Like if I don't do this, I'm going to get negative effects, but I'm barely getting the positive effects anymore. I think that's a great moment to reflect on, maybe my relationships change now. And so that's a subtle one, but I think kind of thinking about where on a spectrum, is it still really enjoyable to you? Or is it just a little more like, oh, not doing it is hard?
I'm going to just follow that up and say that I agree with Tom, and I think it might be in the kind of cluster of symptoms that we see associated with withdrawal. If you start to have those experiences with withdrawal, as if you're not using cannabis exactly the same time that you always use every time, that might be indicative that you're developing a physiological change that is potentially going to negatively impact you and might be a time for a tolerance break then. I think as Tom was saying, if you started taking cannabis for anxiety and it really helped then, but now you're taking cannabis to avoid the anxiety that comes when you are not taking cannabis, then I think that's also a really good sign.
Yeah, I agree with both my colleagues that it all comes down to what are you trying to do with the cannabis and is it working? And they seem like really simple questions, but when you're in the mix of it, when you're suffering from anxiety or pain or PTSD, what have you, it's sometimes difficult without actually getting out a spiral ring notebook and a couple of big pens and actually tracking the days that you're having flashbacks, the number of panic attacks you're having, the number of nights where you're spending more than an hour trying to get to sleep. Without having that sort of hard understanding of, is the cannabis helping? It's hard to know when might be a good time to back off. So that's part of my counseling with all of my patients on medical cannabis, is to know what are you trying to do with the cannabis and then try to figure out whether or not it's working.
Great. Thank you all for that. And feel free, anyone, if you have any questions, please either drop it in the chat or raise your hand. Certainly try to get to yours as well. We do have one from Dr. Attiance on our research team. Wondering if younger adults could have several use breaks in the past 6 months, since the average tea break was 2.5 weeks. Suspect there could be several of them. Is that plausible?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that absolutely is plausible. We found that people were taking multiple tea breaks. Something I didn't mention is that we did look at the number of tea breaks to see if it was predictive of anything, and it wasn't. It was just the single duration, or the duration of a single episode that was predictive. But absolutely, I think this is a very common behavior that might have really positive adaptive outcomes. But I think just figuring out how best to recommend individuals do it.
I did want to follow up with a question that we had talked about in one of our previous meetings. Follow Dr. Peter Grinspoon a bunch on his work, instructor at Harvard and cannabis clinician at Mass General, talking about some of the problems in the scales of the DSM-5 and the QDR when determining cannabis use disorder. I guess really the big issue that he has with it is kind of within the medical cannabis population, of the items where you're using every single day and increasing dose since you started, being kind of adding to that. Have you guys noticed any of that in terms of its validity, or kind of how do you guys seek to control for that in your research? And Ben, maybe I'll put you on the spot because I know that we've talked about this a little bit more.
Yeah, certainly. So there's actually a really interesting paper. I'm going to copy and paste the citation into the chat box here. It's by Sagar and colleagues, circa 2021. And they had two major concerns with the use of the QDR among people who are using medical cannabis, as opposed to those who are using recreational or those who are using illicitly. they boil down to two domains. The first domain is in fact frequency, right? If a person has chronic neuropathic pain and the cannabis, or even better yet, let's use a model of Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, a epileptiform condition where you have seizures if you don't have CBD on board, right? If a person is not consistently dosing that medication multiple times a day, they're prone to have the symptom that they're trying to treat come back. In this case, in Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, seizures. So that person would score pretty highly on frequency scores for the QDID-R. So their first question of the QDID-R is how at 0 points for never, up to 4 points for 4 more times a week, that person would score 4 points. The other critique that they had is a little bit more nuanced, and it has to do with the fact that the QDID-R was developed before the DSM-5 came out. It was developed when they were using DSM-4 criteria to determine cannabis use disorder. Now, what's the big difference between 4 and 5 is that DSM-5 includes a measure of cravings for cannabis, and that's something that's not reflected in the QDID-R that may be more predictive of problematic use or a certain kind of psychological dependency. So yeah, those are the two big critiques that SAGAR makes. And I guess this is a different question popping up in the chat box. But yes, I'll curtail my remarks to those two things, yes.
Yeah. And I would just add on to, I heard Dr. Grinspoon talk about this, and it was compelling because he's just making the point that regular use of a medical, he was just comparing it to using Adderall in some way, that it would push you more than halfway over the definition just because you're using it daily and you're using it frequently. There would be a question about tolerance, so it doesn't. But it's a relevant point. I actually pile on to my concern about the QDID-R because of the 8th question. The audit was created by the World Health Organization looking at alcohol and is widely used and well used. My concern with the QDID, they just mostly swapped out the term alcohol for cannabis. But the 8th question is, have you ever thought about cutting back? And that's where I actually think my thought would be, Dr. Ansel, it's not so much the question about frequency that would flag people. It's that question. If we understand stages of change, that somebody who's pre-contemplative is less risky on the QDID scale than somebody who's contemplative. If you've thought about changing, like, oh, maybe I'm using too much, that moves you halfway towards hazardous use. Just being contemplative. You're better off using frequently and not being contemplative about it on the QDID. And so that idea that you're thoughtful about your own use, moving you towards hazard, is a problem in the fundamental design of that. Just an issue I have.
Yeah, I can appreciate there's a lot of critiques of the QDID-R, and obviously from our discussion before is why I added some additional analyses to show the relevance of that. I think there's a couple things. That article that Ben did share, one of the conclusions that they actually draw is that future research with medical users should use the DSM-5 SCID, which is what we used in my study, because that allows the interviewer to actually take these things into account. We're not relying on the participant to figure it out what we mean by this particular item. It allows us as the clinicians, as the interviewers, to make that determination. And so I think it is interesting in this study that both indices did show increases over time. Whether it's self-report, whether it's clinician interviewer report, both of those things increased. I also think that it is interesting that I think you make an interesting point that being contemplative about reducing your use, that could increase that. And I'm happy to rerun those analyses without that item in it to see.
That'd be interesting.
Yeah, and that maybe that would change it. But I think that there's still a lot of other items in those measures, whether we're talking about the DSM or the QDID, that are indicative of problematic use. And when we look at the overall scores of these individuals, it's not one single item that is causing them to be elevated on the score. It's a combination of items that are getting them there. So I think that, yes, we need to do a better job of measuring. The other thing I'll say is that I think that we need to move from occasions of use to better measurement of quantity. Because as I said earlier, you can have someone who uses every single day and they have really controlled use. But you can also have someone that's using once or twice a week, and they're using in terms of amount or potency way more than that person that's using every single day. I think we need better ways to quantify and measure and distinguish those individuals so we can have a better measurement and better understanding of things.
Great, thanks for that. Those answers from our panelists. I did want to circle back to a question from April Mensler in the chat. And do any of you provide any particular instruction? I guess this would be a little bit more for Tom and Ben. Do you provide any particular instruction to people when they go about reintroducing cannabis after a break?
Yeah, and Dr. Ben, go ahead. But I certainly,
yeah, so-
I'm sure we're on the same page.
Yeah, I always just recommend that people, again, think about what are you trying to do with the cannabis? And then is your therapeutic goal kind of in line with the research that we have on what works and what doesn't? So, we talked about anxiety, low doses versus high doses. PTSD is another example in which we understand that cannabis use may be really effective for dream suppression in PTSD, but that daytime use can actually worsen some measures of PTSD functioning. So, I talk about reintroducing at lower doses, generally slower, and then in accordance with sort of the patterns or recommendations of what little clinical research exists on the qualifying conditions.
And I just add in that tolerance, taking a break works to reduce your chemical tolerance. That we see that, and so I just want that if you've taken a break for more than a week, it's probably worked, and you do not want to go back to the same amount you were using. So start that idea of go low, start slow from psychedelic wisdom is very applicable in that, in terms of just take it easy when you first return, and enjoy that. There's a deeper conversation to be had there, and gets into a little bit in the guide, but the cannabis is mostly a subtle substance, right? That it's not, alcohol hits you, particularly if you're drinking a lot of it. Cannabis can, with high, edibles, but enjoy the subtlety of it again. What you brought back with the tea break is that you're feeling things that you missed when you were taking high potency dabs just a moment ago. Now with a little bit of weed, you're getting high, like, oh, enjoy that. So both, do use less, but also, hey, sit back and enjoy that experience.
Great. So I do want to get two more questions in here. We'll get to one by Hannah in the chat. In either study, did the study design account for different delivery methods, such as flower, concentrates, or ingestibles?
I can speak to my study. We didn't include that in particular in this analysis, but we did look at modalities of use. The study design also included 3 weeks of ecological momentary assessment. So we had them report on their modalities and their experiences and their use patterns extensively every day. And in a study that was done separately from this by my grad student, Maggie Badillion, she published showing that, as Tom was just saying, it's the high potency products that are predicting the worst outcomes, the changes in the same kinds of outcomes that I just showed to you. So I think that it'd be a very interesting question to look specifically at how modality use might change before and after a tolerance break. And hopefully we'll have some data coming in soon that will tell us more about that.
And Tom, did your study look at modalities at all?
And not based on outcomes, but we were certainly interested mostly in what people were using. Yeah. And
Okay.
flower seems to remain king, but people dabble in lots of things.
And I did want to ask one question for future research. Are there any important, I think certainly kind of reevaluating the DSM-5 and the Q-R being that, but for future directions of research, is there anything that you guys are kind of looking forward to moving forward? I know we have our taper study coming up. So Ben, if you want to talk a little bit about that or any other considerations.
Yeah, so just very briefly, we have a study that will begin recruiting hopefully in the next month or so. We're looking at medical cannabis patients who are deciding to take tolerance breaks, and we're determining if cold turkey versus one of two strategies of either tapering off your baseline product that you're using or tapering off using a one-to-one CBD to THC troche improves your ability to complete successfully a cannabis tea break, and whether or not these tapering plans improve your withdrawal scores throughout the first week or so.
Thanks for that, Ben. And thank you to everyone for showing up. Wanted to just take the time to say thank you to Tom and Emily for your time. Thank you, Ben, as well. This was definitely a very great process for me, being able to talk with you guys a few times leading up to this and kind of understanding a little bit more about your work. I do want to mention that we'll be having our next set of speaker series starting in the fall, September, October, and November. So be on the lookout for new invitations via email. And wanted to say thanks again for everyone involved.
Appreciate it. I'm going to put my email in the chat if anyone has questions. I see Melissa had one we couldn't get to, but I'd be happy to take that offline, Melissa, or anything. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, and I've put Tom's tea break guide link in the chat box there. We're including that as part of our tea break study as well. I forgot to mention that.
Brilliant.
Thanks so much, Ben, Tom, Emily. Really great presentation, great discussion.